Some moments slip into your life so quietly, you don't notice they're about to change. Everything. Not with grand gestures or explosions of light, but in the soft, unnoticed spaces. When you're just existing unaware that the ground beneath you is already shifting, that's how it was for me on a Thursday afternoon in my kitchen, where the world felt as predictable as the ticking of the old wall clock. The kitchen smelled of warm custard simmering, gently on the stove, its sweet vanilla scent curling through the air. Golden sunlight slanted through the window, painting the tiled floor in soft, fading stripes. The clock? Steady tick. Talk was the only sound, a rhythm so familiar it barely registered. I stood there, stirring the pot, my hair pulled back, an apron tied loosely around my waist. At 43, I was Elizabeth Harper Liz to most people, but lately I'd started to feel like a shadow of that name, invisible not just to others but to myself. I wasn't always like this. There was a time when I laughed louder, when my days felt full of color. But somewhere along the way, life had dulled like an old photograph left too long in the sun. I kept stirring, watching the custard thicken, wondering when I'd stopped expecting anything more from days like this. The kitchen was my refuge, the one place where I could still create something tangible. But even here, the silence was heavy, pressing against me like a weight I couldn't name. I didn't know it yet, but that silence was about to break. James, my husband, was a good man, at least by the standards most people use. He worked hard, paid the bills, never raised his voice, but goodness on paper doesn't always translate to warmth in real life. He was always somewhere else on his phone, in a meeting or lost in his own thoughts, even when he was home sitting across from me at the dinner table. His eyes stayed glued to the news or his emails. "Thanks, Liz," he'd mutter when I set a plate in front of him, never looking up. I'd smile, nod, and swallow the ache that came with being unseen. Our house was too quiet. Dinners passed with the clink of forks and little else. Our weekends stretched long and empty, filled with routines that felt more like transactions than a life shared. In bed, we slept back to back, the space between us cold and vast, like a country we'd both forgotten how to cross. I'd lie awake sometimes staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was just what marriage became after 20 years. Had I asked for too much, expecting to still feel wanted? Or had I simply faded my edges, blurring until I was no longer someone worth noticing? I tried to fill the gaps. I cooked elaborate meals, tended the garden, kept the house spotless, but no amount of effort could drown out the loneliness that had settled into my bones. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was slow, subtle, like watching the life drain from something you once loved. And the worst part, I wasn't sure if I was mourning James or myself. The front door creaked open that afternoon, pulling me from my thoughts. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting James, but it was Ethan. His backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder at 19. Ethan was James's son from his first marriage, home from college for a few weeks while his dad traveled for work. I'd known him since he was 10, back when I taught him how to scramble eggs and packed his lunches with little notes tucked inside. We'd always been close, sharing a kind of easy banter that felt like a lifeline in a house where words were scarce. "Smells good in here," Ethan said, dropping his bag by the door. His voice was deeper now, carrying a confidence that hadn't been there. The last time he visited, I turned to face him, and for a moment I barely recognized the boy I'd helped raise. He was taller, his shoulders broader, his dark hair slightly tousled, but it was his eyes that caught me off guard, sharp, thoughtful, like they saw more than they let on. He leaned against the counter, a faint smile tugging at his lips, and I felt a flicker of something I couldn't place. "Just custard," I said, waving a hand toward the stove. "Nothing fancy." I went back to stirring, trying to shake the odd awareness that had crept in. Ethan had always been a bright spot in my life, someone who laughed at my dumb jokes and didn't mind my chatter. But this Ethan felt different, less like the kid who'd needed me and more like a stranger who was somehow familiar. He crossed his arms, watching me with that same quiet smile. "You always make the house feel alive, Liz," he said, and the words landed softer than they should have. I laughed it off, brushing away the warmth they stirred. He was just being kind. I told myself nothing more. But as he lingered there, the kitchen felt a little less empty, and I wasn't sure if that comforted me or scared me. The days after Ethan's arrival felt different, though I couldn't pinpoint why. At first, the kitchen, my usual sanctuary, hummed with a new energy whenever he wandered in. That Tuesday, I was kneading dough for dinner rolls, flour dusting my hands, when I heard his footsteps. The soft creak of the floorboards announced him before his voice did. "Need a sous chef?" he asked, leaning against the doorway, his grin Easy, but his eyes steady like he was studying me. I laughed, brushing a stray lock of hair from my face. Only if you can keep up, I teased, expecting him to grab a snack and leave like he used to, but Ethan stayed rolling up his sleeves, asking about the recipe as if it mattered. He listened, really listened, when I rambled about swapping butter for oil. His questions weren't just polite. They lingered, pulling details from me I hadn't shared in years. What did I do today? How'd I learn to bake like this? His voice was warm, his gaze unwavering, and I felt a flicker of something I hadn't in ages, being seen. The kitchen smelled of yeast and possibility, the late afternoon, light casting long shadows across the counter. I told myself it was nothing, just Ethan being kind the way he'd always been, but kindness doesn't make your chest tighten or your words stumble. As he chopped herbs beside me, his arm brushing mine, I caught myself smiling too long, my hands pausing mid-task. I shook it off, focusing on the dough, but the air felt charged like the moment before a storm breaks. That night alone in the dark of my bedroom, I couldn't sleep. James was away again, some conference in Chicago, leaving the house. To its usual silence, I lay there staring at the ceiling, the glow of the streetlights seeping through the blinds. My mind kept drifting back to the kitchen, to Ethan's laugh. His questions, the way his presence filled the empty spaces I'd grown used to. It wasn't right. This warmth spreading through me, but I couldn't stop it. I'd been hungry for so long, not for food, but for something I couldn't name. James hadn't touched me in months, hadn't asked about my day in years. I remembered my last birthday. Waiting for a call, a note, anything. Nothing came. I'd baked a cake, lit a candle, and sat alone at the table, the silence louder than any words. James came home late, asked what was for dinner, and didn't notice the frosting on my plate. That night, I'd cried in the shower, not because he forgot, but because I wasn't surprised. The loneliness had crept in slowly, wrapping around me like a fog. I'd kept going, cooking, cleaning, smiling when I was supposed to, but inside I was fading. Ethan's attention, small, as it was, felt like a crack in that fog, letting light through. I hated how much I craved it. How is casual, you're good at this? Liz stayed with me, replaying. In the quiet, I told myself to stop, to keep my distance, but my heart was already reaching, desperate for a taste of something real, even if it was just a crumb. By Thursday, the kitchen had become our unspoken meeting place. I was trying a new custard recipe, the kind my mom used to make, stirring slowly as the mixture thickened. The radio played softly, an old jazz tune weaving through the air, and the scent of vanilla filled the room. The sunlight was softer now, late afternoon turning. The walls a warm amber. I was humming, lost in the rhythm of the spoon, when Ethan appeared, his silhouette filling the doorway. "Caught you baking again," he said, his voice light, but his eyes curious, like he was searching for something. I glanced over my shoulder, smiling. "You always show up when there's sugar involved." He laughed, a sound that warmed the room, and stepped inside, leaning against the counter. His plain t-shirt hugged his frame, his hair slightly messy, but it was his gaze that held me steady, unreadable, like he saw past the apron and the flour. Dusted hands, I held out the spoon, a dollop of custard glistening. "Taste this. Tell me if it's too sweet." He didn't move at first, just watched me, a slow smile curving his lips. "Only if you feed it to me," he said, half joking, but his tone was low, deliberate. My breath caught, but I played it off, rolling my eyes. "What, you're too fancy for a spoon now?" I lifted it toward him, expecting a quick taste, a laugh, the moment to pass. But Ethan stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine. He leaned in, slow and intentional, his lips brushing the spoon as he took the custard. The air stilled, the jazz fading to a hum. Clocks tick, suddenly too loud. He didn't smile, didn't blink, just held my gaze, and I felt the world tilt. My hand trembled, the spoon hovering between us, and I laughed too sharp, too. Quick turning to the sink to rinse it, but my fingers shook and the kitchen felt smaller. The walls closing in, I told myself it was nothing. A silly moment, but my heart was pounding. And deep down, I knew this wasn't about the custard. It was something else. Something dangerous, and I wasn't sure I wanted it to stop. The kitchen had become our unspoken territory, a place where the ordinary felt charged with something I couldn't name. By the next week, Ethan was there almost every evening, chopping vegetables while I stirred sauces, his presence as natural as the hum of the fridge. The air smelled of garlic and rosemary, the stove's warmth softening the edges of the room. We moved around each other with ease, like dancers who knew the steps by heart. He'd tease me about my old playlist. I'd mock his knife skills, and we'd laugh, the sound filling the house in a way it hadn't in years. But there were moments, small, fleeting, that made my breath catch. His hand grazed mine as we reached for the same spice jar, his fingers lingering a second too long. Once he stood behind me to grab a bowl, his chest brushing my shoulder, and I froze, the spoon in my hand forgotten. I told myself it was nothing, just the closeness of cooking together, but my skin tingled where he'd been, and my heart raced long after he stepped away. The radio played softly, its melodies weaving through the steam and the golden light of dusk made everything feel too warm, too intimate. I tried to keep things light too. Stay the Liz who'd packed his lunches years ago. But Ethan wasn't that boy anymore. His questions grew personal about my dreams, my past things never asked. His eyes held mine when he spoke, like I was the only person in the room. I felt alive. In those moments, seen in a way I'd forgotten was possible. But with every laugh, every glance, a voice in my head grew louder, warning me to step back before I fell too. Far I met Sarah for coffee that Friday, needing air, needing perspective. The cafe was cozy, all wooden tables and the clink of mugs, the air thick with the scent of roasted beans. Sarah, my friend since college, had a way of seeing through me. Her dark curls bounced as she leaned forward, her eyes narrowing over her latte. "You're different, Liz," she said, her voice blunt but kind. "You're glowing. What's going on?" I sipped my coffee, the bitterness grounding me. I told her about Ethan's visit, how he'd been helping in the kitchen, how his laughter made the house feel less empty. But I left out the rest. The glances, the touches, the way. My pulse quickened when he was near. Sarah listened, her brow furrowing. "He's 19, Liz, and he's James's son. Be careful. You're not yourself right now." Her words hit like a splash of cold water. I nodded, forcing a smile, but inside I was reeling. Was I that obvious? Had I crossed a line without realizing it? The cafe's chatter faded, the sunlight streaming through the window suddenly too bright. Sarah reached for my hand, her touch steady. "You're lonely? I get it. James hasn't been there. But don't let a kid's kindness fill a hole that's not his to fix." I drove home her warning echoing in my head. She was right, I knew she was, but the thought of pulling away from Ethan felt like losing the only warmth I'd found. In years, the house loomed ahead, its quiet waiting to swallow me again. I gripped the steering wheel, torn between what I knew was right and what I couldn't stop wanting. It was a Tuesday night, the kind of evening where the world feels too still. James was gone, some late meeting across town, and the house was ours. I sat on the couch, a glass of red wine on the coffee table, the TV flickering with a show I wasn't watching. The living room was dim, the glow of a single lamp casting shadows on the walls. I pulled a blanket over my legs, trying to shake the restlessness that had settled in my chest. Ethan walked in quiet, like he wasn't sure he should be there. He didn't say anything, just sat on the other end of the couch, closer than usual, his warmth radiating across the space between us. The air felt heavy, the hum of the TV barely audible. I glanced at him, his face half lit, his eyes fixed on the floor. "You look sad tonight," he said softly, his voice cutting through the silence. I didn't mean to answer, but the words spelled out. "I don't think anyone sees me anymore," I said, my voice trembling. "I cook, I clean, I show up, but it's like I'm invisible." He turned to me, his gaze steady, certain. "I'd notice," he said low, "and sure I see you, Liz, more than anyone ever has." My breath caught, not from surprise, but from the truth in his words. The room shrank, the shadows deepening, the air thick with something unspoken. I should have stood up, changed the subject, anything to break the moment. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned toward him, slow, like my body knew what my mind couldn't admit. His lips met mine, soft at first, hesitant, then deeper, warm and trembling. For one stolen second, I wasn't invisible. I was wanted alive. Real. Then reality crashed in. I pulled back, my heart pounding, and stood, the blanket falling to the floor. "Ethan?" I whispered, but I couldn't look at him. I fled to the hallway, the darkness swallowing me as I shut the door, my body shaking against it. I was alive, but I was terrified, and I didn't know if I'd just found myself or lost everything. The morning after the kiss, the kitchen felt like a stranger's house. The familiar scent of coffee couldn't mask the tension that hung in the air, thick and unyielding. I stood at the counter, gripping a mug, the ceramic warm against my palms, but my hands trembled. The sunlight streaming through the window was too harsh, exposing every crack in the facade I'd tried to maintain. Ethan was already there when I walked in, pouring cereal into a bowl, his eyes fixed on the task like it required all his focus. Morning.